Before we dive into this episode, today is March 5th, 2025, and I want to share some recent important updates regarding the Corporate Transparency Act that have taken place since I initially recorded this episode on February 14th. At that time, enforcement of the CTA was under a nationwide injunction, which meant that BOI reporting requirements were not in effect. On this episode, I compared the CTA to the Terminator, and it really couldn't be a more appropriate metaphor because like Arnold's relentless cyborg, the CTA just keeps finding a way to come back to life. So on February 17th and 18th, respectively, a few days after my initial recording, the nationwide injunction was lifted, meaning BOI reporting requirements were once again back in effect. FinCEN also announced that the BOI reporting deadline was extended by 30 calendar days, so most reporting companies had until March 21st, 2025 to file their BOI reports. Then, a little over a week later on February 27th, FinCEN announced that it will not issue any fines or penalties or take any other enforcement action against companies that fail to file or update their BOI reports until a forthcoming interim final rule becomes effective. And that rule, along with updated reporting deadlines, would be issued no later than March 21st, 2025. Finally, on March 2nd, the Treasury Department issued a press release that essentially suspends enforcement of the CTA, including any penalties or fines associated with BOI reporting for any domestic companies or U.S. citizens. The Treasury Department also stated that it will issue proposed rulemaking to narrow the scope of BOI reporting such that only certain foreign companies registered to do business in the U.S. would need to comply. Is this truly the end of the CTA? Or, like the Terminator, will it somehow rise from the ashes and come staggering toward us? Only time will tell. Of course, you can always find the latest information regarding the CTA on FinCEN's website. Lastly, please remember that at the time of our discussion in this episode, the CTA was still under a nationwide injunction, and none of the recent updates I just walked through have been announced yet. Hope you enjoy. Today, I'm joined by Farella partner Greg LeSaint and Farella senior paralegal Joe Hilliard to discuss the movie The Terminator. Like the Terminator traveling back in time, Greg, Joe, and I discussed the recent events concerning the Corporate Transparency Act, including where the CTA's enforcement stands today. And we also introduce and discuss the estate planning benefits of a qualified personal residence trust. Should you still file your BOI report? What should Sarah Connor's mom do with her cabin in Big Bear? We explore those questions and more. So come with me if you want to live. Welcome to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film, brought to you by the Private Client Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. I'm Hans Young, a family wealth partner at Farella. Through this podcast, my guests and I will provide an entertaining look at family wealth and estate planning topics through well-known Hollywood movies. Each episode will focus on a single movie as we discuss fun facts, review our favorite scenes, and engage in thought-provoking discussions of real-world legal issues. And lastly, do you agree with our verdict? Is the movie a guilty pleasure or just not guilty? Again, welcome to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film. Well, I'm excited to welcome back my colleagues Greg LeSaint and Joe Hilliard as my guests on the podcast today. Greg is a partner at Farella. His business transactions practice focuses on corporate and financial transactions, including mergers and acquisitions, secured lending, fund formation, corporate finance, secondary and derivative transactions, restructurings, and general corporate representation. He's a trusted advisor to owners, operating companies, family offices, private equity and real estate funds, banks, private clients, high-tech executives, entrepreneurs, and investors. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella, and he specializes in formation and compliance matters for all types of entities, and in particular, 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. Prior to joining Farella, Joe worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Greg and Joe, with those elaborate and long introductions, welcome back to the podcast.
Cool. It's great to be here. Thanks, Hans.
I should mention that this is our first three-person episode, which is, I think, really appropriate because there are three main characters in this movie. I guess we can duke it out after about who's who. In our previous episodes together, Greg, you and I discussed John Wick. Joe, we discussed RoboCop, and we did that focusing on various aspects of the Corporate Transparency Act, or the CTA. And with the recent, shall we call it, drama surrounding the enforcement of the CTA, I started to picture the CTA as the Terminator, in that it just keeps coming back to life. So thanks so much for joining me. I know you both also appreciate this movie. I think before we dive into the CTA, as well as an estate planning vehicle known as a qualified personal residence trust, Let's get started with some fun facts about the movie. The movie released on October 26, 1984. It grossed $78.3 million on a $6.4 million budget. Really pretty good. Its success led to 5 sequels. I think one was technically a prequel. That was Terminator Genesis. Honestly, I can't even remember when I watched it for the first time. I was certainly a kid, was probably at home on VHS. And this is technically not true because I'm a little older than the movie, but it feels like this movie's been in existence my entire life. I can remember me and my friends leaving for bathroom breaks in the middle of class and saying, I'll be back. Rewatching it today or in preparation for this episode, it's interesting because it feels both futuristic and old at the same time. You know, we don't yet have quite the Terminator type technology, although AI may be heading us in that direction. Yet the characters in the movie rely heavily on things that are completely outdated or obsolete. Payphones, phone books, answering machines. When did each of you watch the movie for the first time, and what are your memories of it?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about it because really I think my introduction to the Terminator was actually Terminator 2 because it was more age appropriate at the time. And so
Y'all making me feel old over here.
Yeah, no, I recall my older brother having seen it, and I just recall this very cool aura about it. And I think I ultimately watched the entire film probably much later. And I've probably seen it since then, probably about 2 times in the last, now rewatching it for this episode, but I've probably seen it about 2 times. So it has very recent memory for me, but I agree. It's it has this timeliness to it. When you rewatch it, you see so many things that I don't know if it was the first to do some of these things, but you've definitely seen it repeated many, many times since. Your 2 previous films that you worked, that you talked about, John Wick, RoboCop, both of them have like elements of the Terminator in them, just definitely. So it's a cool movie to revisit and see just what a impact it had on just movies and cinema afterwards.
So we'll delve a little into movie history here too. My mom worked downtown Los Angeles. She worked for the Federal Reserve Bank actually in the early 80s, and she was working late. And I can remember as a kid, we went down, my dad and I, to pick her up after work, and there was a bunch of excitement, and the Second Street Tunnel was closed because they were filming the Terminator where they drive through that. So that was the first time we had seen it, and we'd seen signs that said, they're making a movie called The Terminator, like, oh, and they're blowing up stuff in the tunnels. And so, I was like 12, we're like, this is exciting. We got to wait for this to come out next year. And so for us as a teenager, then as like an early preteen, seeing it in the theater when it first came out, Hans and I laughed about this with seeing RoboCop last time, but this too was another one of those big things where you're like a kid and you're just in the theater and it was just big and explosive. And you're like, oh my God, and they're destroying parts of Los Angeles. And you're like, I know where that is. It was really a really exciting, fun thing to see in the theaters. And then, same thing, I had friends as we went into college that would, same thing, all be Bach everywhere all the time, even into that then when I was in Terminator 2 came out when I was in college, I can remember that, the excitement of then we'd had same thing, going down to the video store and renting the VCR, the video of the first one to watch it over and over again before we went to see T2.
Yeah, no, T2 I think had a bigger impact on my childhood. Like Greg mentioned, I was older at that point. And I think it took a lot of the best parts of this first one and kind of did it better. But, at the time, this was directed by James Cameron, who we obviously know now. I mean, he's a household name as far as directors go. He wasn't as known at the time when this came out. He later directed, a lot of big movies. Aliens, that was 86. He did direct Terminator 2 in 91, True Lies, which also stars Arnold Schwarzenegger, Titanic, Avatar. So some really big blockbusters. One of the interesting facts, and this ties into I think coincidentally what you just said, Joe, about your experience with this movie at the time it was being filmed, is that I saw that throughout filming, Cameron often resorted to what he called guerrilla filmmaking. So this is his way of getting around acquiring permits needed to film certain scenes. So the production crew and actors would quickly arrive at a location, shoot the scene, and then leave before the police arrived. And so as a result, some of the extras are actual everyday folks who are completely unaware that they're in a movie. So maybe on your next rewatch, you scour that. Maybe you and your mom are standing somewhere on a street corner.
In the tunnels.
I also saw that, so Schwarzenegger worked with guns every day for a month, which doesn't seem that long, I guess, but to prepare for the role, I feel like when you and I were talking about John Wick and Keanu Reeves, It sounded like he prepared for like months on end. A month every day, I guess, is impressive. He, like John Wick, he only has 17 lines in the movie for about 70 words. And his iconic catchphrase, "I'll be back," was originally scripted as "I'll come back." Schwarzenegger actually was then, I think he sparred with James Cameron a little bit because he wanted it to say, "I will come back," or "I will be back." So that, his argument was that he's a cyborg and, the cyborg wouldn't use a contraction, but he lost that battle, obviously, and it worked out. I also saw that Schwarzenegger had his eyebrows insured because he feared that they might not grow back properly. He had to shave them for a scene where he runs over the burning car after the tech noir shootout. Those are the ones I found. Any other fun facts either of you want to quickly share?
I think it's interesting. You were just talking about James Cameron, and like you said, the next movie he makes after this is Aliens, and you see so much of the Aliens cast in the background. You see Bill Paxton as the punk at the beginning. Obviously, you have Michael Biehn starring, who then continues to star, and then Lance Henriksen is this. Bishop is this poor cop schmuck at the police station shootout who's doing his best, and it's just interesting to see all these people in the background as you see that, and again that where Cameron had worked for Roger Corman and done like B movies behind. So obviously that's why we're talking about how he can knows this guerrilla stuff. And same thing where he shouts out to that. Dick Miller has this great quick performance as the gun seller that's trying to get the Schwarzenegger's trying to get these guns from. And the poor thing goes, "I want a plasma gun and a 30 watts. And Dick Miller just goes, "Hey, all you see is what's on the shelves," before he shoots him. These great little shout outs to like funky little Hollywood things in the past and then towards the future that Cameron does is just really amazing when you see it in that whole history of things.
Yeah, you stole my thunder there a little bit, Joe, because Aliens is by far, one of my favorite action movies. And so I know we'll talk about favorite, but just when you see all the characters from that movie pop up in this movie, and you can't help, like Bill Paxton just makes me smile every time he comes on screen and he shows up here and he's the head punk. And
yeah, which leads to like one of the weirdest moments. The thing is, how does Arnold Schwarzenegger fit into Bill Paxton's clothes? Because he kills Adam Baldwin and he says, "Give me your clothes to Bill Paxton." I'm thinking, how is he going to wear that?
Yeah, I guess, in Aliens, you could totally have had, it would have been an interesting sort of like sliding doors moment where if you have Linda Hamilton playing Sigourney Weaver's role. Wanted to next cover kind of our favorite scene as we do on this podcast. I'll give you 9 options, which we'll run through very quickly. I think one of the last ones we had, there was like 17 scenes, I think, for RoboCop, but we've got the arrivals of the Terminator and Bill Paxton plays like, I think, the lead punk. So he deals with those 3 punks that are giving him trouble. Kyle Reese, he drops down and he's running from the cops immediately. So there's that, just kind of that duo, we'll call one scene. There's all of Reese's flash forwards to the year 2029. We'll put those together. There's when Sarah Connor, Reese, and Terminator all meet at the Tech Noir nightclub. That's actually a term. So the name of the club is Tech Noir. That's a term that I read that it's coined by James Cameron. It refers to a film genre when you combine the styles of sci-fi and film noir. So think Blade Runner and things like that. This scene, widely considered a sci-fi masterpiece for its style, music, look, and feel. I think it's also cool because watching it back, we see the world through Terminator's eyes, I think, for the first time in the movie in that scene. So also, I think they pull on that in the movie Predator, which also stars Schwarzenegger when, I think you see everything through this heat vision or infrared. And it also reveals that the Terminator cannot be easily stopped or destroyed. That's sort of all revealed in that scene. And then I'm going to combine all of these in the number 4, which is there's 3 car chases. And earlier when I said that I think Terminator 2 takes a lot of these elements and does it better, I think the car chase scene in Terminator 2 is one of the best I can remember from my childhood, where, Arnold's like, he's reloading the sawed-off shotgun, I think, with one hand, and he's flipping it. And of course, in that one, he's the good guy. He's the hero. There's the scene where Terminator repairs himself. And then there's a number of scenes I'm combining into one. This is I'll call this Sarah Connors and Reese's hide and seek scenes. It's because they're basically just hiding a lot in the movie. They're hiding in the parking garage. They're hiding in the tunnel. They hide at the Tiki Motel. There's the infamous battle between Terminator and the officers at a police station. where he says his iconic line, "I'll be back." There's a final battle at the automated production facility where they Sarah ultimately defeats Terminator. And then there's the final, Sarah drives towards the horizon and the storm. Notably in that scene, she's making audio recordings for her unborn son, John Connor. That's where she gets her photo taken by a kid that later in the future, John gives that photo to Reese, and then Reese comes back. The timeline and the kind of the Back to the Future stuff doesn't really make sense, but we'll put that aside. Of those 9 scenes, which one stood out to you, or what's your favorite?
Go for it, Greg. Since I stepped on your thunder about the alien stuff, I feel bad. So you get to go first this time.
There's a lot there, and you're combining things. I'll say, I was originally going to say I like the first cop scene, because that's when you see Lance Hendrickson come up, and you've now completed this trifecta of Aliens actors. But since we've already gone there, I'll say I really appreciate the opening of this movie, and you don't see this style a lot, where it's just there's a paragraph of text just kind of giving you just this very basic, you have a clear understanding right away of what's going on. There's not really a lot of exposition that just happens. The movie just starts and you're already into it. And, the machines are coming out, the guy's picking up the trash can, and suddenly Arnold Schwarzenegger drops out, and you're suddenly just in this movie and you're already there. And you're within 5 minutes, he's already met Bill Paxton and done all of these things, and you're just immediately dropped into the movie. I just think it's such a cool way of opening up a movie. And again, it sort of has these elements that you saw probably more in the 80s, that type of opening. But, it's again, just a movie that grips you right away. You don't have to have all of this backstory going on. You don't have to have all of this lengthy exposition. You're just suddenly in this very, very cool science fiction movie.
We've talked about a couple of one of them that you hit that's great. And one of the things I love about this, and again, this comes from old school stuff being here, I love practical effects. I love real world use of it. And so you talked about the surgery, the dummy of Arnold's head where he cuts his eye off open because he's been wounded, and this weird visceral effect there. And there's one shot where it looks really, really fake, but you don't care. Right. It's like this whole visceral thing, and the guy in the background, what are you doing? Killing cats in there? It's just like, it's this weird, that's part of the fun, I think, of this too. I talked a little bit about Dick Millen. We've talked about Bill Paxton. It's deadly serious, but there's sort of this wry sense of humor with all the characters themselves, of what they say, how they're doing things. That's just really a lot of fun. There's the dumb jump scare with the iguana in the shower. It's so 80s. Oh, here's this big, but it works perfectly. It just gives you this kind of, oh yeah, you're kind of in on this. And then it's deadly serious. And then, like I said, the last great special practical effect to the stop motion of just the burned off flesh Terminator as it comes out and it walks towards you. When we talk about RoboCop, the stop motion effects of the Ed 209 a few years later, and arguably this is 3 years earlier on a much lower, cheaper budget, and the effects are so amazing. It's this great robot effect, and you're like, oh my god! So whenever I see it, that makes me smile just to see the robot.
Yeah, no, I'd actually argue that the effects in this one almost seem, despite it being earlier and being released earlier, I feel like it's in some ways better or more believable than some of the stuff we saw in RoboCop. I mean, I had some problems with the, what was it? Ed 209, the crying scene, which you loved. And I won't step on that.
I love that kind of stuff, but yeah.
Those are great ones. I had a couple of them I could share with. I'll just say that I guess the iconic battle between Terminator and the officers at the police station, for all the obvious reasons, I think, right? He says his famous line and then he runs the car into it and he's just taking on everybody there. Rewatching it, part of me was like, the way that the police officers are approaching Terminator, I was like, what are you doing? Like, this is not going to work. Like, a lot of them are yelling at him, like Lance Hendrickson, I think, to avenge like his was it Traxler? He like stands, he goes, hey, and he starts shooting. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't going to work. But then you realize, like, you're reminded that, or I was reminded that they don't actually believe any of Sarah's or Reese's story. So they think this is just some regular guy, and they don't realize it's this futuristic killing machine. So I thought that was just neat. So I'll choose that as my favorite scene. But again, I could have gone a number of different ways, including the ones you guys chose. Let's move into our more substantive discussion, which is the timeline of recent CTA updates. I was thinking about this movie, and this is what prompted me even approach you guys about this recently, was, time travel is kind of an essential element in this movie. The main story takes place in Los Angeles in 1984, but there are flash forwards to 2029 where Reese is from. So I thought it would be really fitting and appropriate if we walk through a timeline of the recent CTA updates, because there's quite a bit there. I'll just do a very brief recap of the CTA. If anyone wants an introduction to it, you go listen to the John Wick and RoboCop episodes. We covered it in more detail there as well, but it's a federal law that requires certain entities to disclose information about their beneficial owners to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, otherwise known as FinCEN. Overall objective is to safeguard the financial system from illicit criminal activity. Greg and Joe, this is where I'm going to pass the baton to you. You are going to be our Kyle Reese, our guide. Please walk us through a timeline of the recent events and what I will refer to as some of the drama that's occurred.
Yeah. So, well, I know the big events started kicking off in early December, actually December 3rd. Was when this nationwide injunction came down. Before that, in March of 2024, there was a court case that enjoined FinCEN from enforcing the Corporate Transparency Act, but that case was limited to the specific plaintiffs in that case that came out of the Northern District of Alabama. All throughout 2024, we had sat with this question, and that case, had some interesting constitutional arguments in it. Procedurally, it was still held up in the courts. And then on December 3rd, 2024, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas issued a preliminary injunction against the government that applied nationwide. So they couldn't enforce it at all. This was Texas Top Cop Shop et al. Versus Garland. And so that actually set off what I think was what some practitioners have been hoping for, what some businesses have been hoping for, which was we had this January 1st, 2025 deadline coming up for any company that was formed before 2024. And we had spent all of 2024 and a lot of even before 2024 trying to, get our clients up to date on what the Corporate Transparency Act required. And here we were 29 days from the actual day when everything was due, and suddenly the federal government cannot enforce it anymore. And so this was a stop the presses moment where people had been preparing filings. People had already done filings. If you formed a company in 2024, you had already done one. And now suddenly we're in this universe where the federal government cannot actually enforce this law. And so the question comes up, well, what do you do? And you do nothing at this point because the federal government's enjoined from doing it. That feeling of maybe exuberation, depending on how libertarian you are, subsided. I think it was a few days before Christmas. I think it was December 23rd.
Yeah, that sounds right. Because it came on a Friday before the holiday, before the weekend where we were going into it.
And before you get there, to use if we equate, and we were kind of chatting about this offline earlier, but if the CTA enforcement is the Terminator, is the early December date? Is that when the equivalent of when they run him over in the Tiki Motel and they think they've stopped him? He falls down momentarily, but then immediately gets up again.
I think everyone knew that the question was not settled at this point, right? This is just coming out of a district court. It's still got to go through the appeals court. You've got many cases throughout various circuits throughout the United States. So I think my take on this is everyone has really thought that because there's so many different circuits at play here, the U.S. Supreme Court is ultimately going to have to decide on the substance of this, that there's likely going to be some split between the circuits. But here we were, and it's okay. Now we do have a pause on it, but no one is necessarily just laying back, going to the beach and feeling like, everything's all well and good, but created this really interesting dynamic in terms of advising clients where you are both saying, you've been preparing for this, but it's not being enforced right now. I think FinCEN at the time did say you can still continue to voluntarily submit your reports. And that's fine. I think for many clients, if you felt you were either well prepared, you didn't want this thing to pop back up and somehow get caught by, a very tight deadline, because January 1st, 2025 was coming right up. That made sense. But for other clients who might have privacy concerns, who didn't want to necessarily voluntarily turn over personal identifiable information to this database, that put them in a different position. So, as practitioners, we had to advise people to follow what they thought was the best practice there, but ultimately they didn't have to comply.
And that's where we had that with you were talking about the different circuits, like we had the one in Alabama here, where even there at that time, there were the competing in the Fifth Circuit where one said it was a stay, then one said it wasn't, and then it was again, where we had that period of a day or two where they put it back into effect and then took it back off. I remember that right around the holidays too. There were two competing Fifth Circuit items going on at the end of the year there, even before it went to the Supreme Court when.
Yeah, I think, Greg, you were just saying it was like December 23rd or something thereabouts.
Yeah. It was a 5-day period, I think. So December 23rd, it was the Fifth Circuit, I believe, right? They said, no, that injunction is improper. But I believe a separate, I don't do a lot in terms of Fed courts or appeals cases like this, but I think it was a separate panel of that same court 5 days later said, no, actually that injunction is going to stand. And so it was this real nasty whipsaw at the end of 2024. I think we were all very relieved on December 28th when we were still in the realm of, okay, nothing's due on January 1st. I think that would have been just really, really difficult.
I know that at that time because I was talking to some of the vendors because obviously there's vendors that have tried to horn in to make a little money off this system as well. And when I was talking to them, the stat I saw was of the approximate 40 million entities that needed to be filed by that January 1st deadline, only about 9 million had actually filed by then. So you're not even talking a quarter of them in place at that time. So I can say from personal experience talking with some of the clients was that before the stay, the system was slow, where it was taking maybe 10 or 15 minutes to load stuff. It was taking 30, 35 minutes at that later junction to actually get your filing done. So the system was definitely slowing as more people went into that. So
yeah. And I think there was a question too, in terms of if that suddenly came back into effect and you had to file, what effect did it have on the existing deadlines?
Right. There was definitely those concerns that it was just going to say, oh, and now they're still due January 1st. As we saw with that, within those windows where they kept coming it back, essentially the days of the stay were the additional days you got. So at one point there was that 5-day stay, put another 5. So now you weren't due till January 6th until that stay went back into place. In the interim, obviously, this was taken by the DOJ up to the Supreme Court. There had been some questions at the end of the year. Obviously, as we were talking about elections, and there would be a changeover, whether the Department of Justice would in fact appeal the stay, which they then did, which is what happens then going into January. I'll let Greg come back to the timeline a little bit on that. But what happens in January once the Supreme Court rules on the stay in the Fifth Circuit?
I think it was January 23rd. So it was shortly after the new administration came in. The Supreme Court said effectively it was a procedural decision saying that effectively the court in the district court in Texas had erred in issuing a nationwide injunction. Effectively, they should have taken the same tack that the district court in northern Alabama had taken, where it had only applied to the plaintiffs in that instance. But that Supreme Court decision only applied to the top cop shop, and there was still the separate...
Smith versus the Department of Treasury was the one that's still in place.
Thank you. Yeah, so that one had not yet been decided by the Supreme Court. And so even though the Supreme Court had eliminated the injunction under top cop shop, the other one still existed. So we were still in this place. And then you also have at this time this question as to when the Trump administration came in on January 20th, they issued a whole series of executive orders, one of which was there's no rulemaking allowed until a new secretary, or basically the new appointees for the Trump administration, came in and could approve of those rules. So now you had a situation where even if the injunction had been lifted, they couldn't actually issue a new rule to change any of the filing deadlines, to do anything that would have actually given any relief. So it was this very interesting period where and we're still somewhat in this, although there is a now, I think most of the cabinet has been appointed. There is a Secretary of Treasury appointed. So I think they can at this point go ahead and issue rules around this. But again, it just sort of led to even more chaos, more uncertainty in terms of what's actually going to be allowed. And I think there was also, there's also this question as to whether or not basically the posture of the new administration with respect to the law. And I think some people have gotten this one point a little bit. Initial Corporate Transparency Act was a part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021. President Trump at the time had vetoed that bill, and it ultimately passed by supermajority in the House and the Senate. However, he didn't veto it for any reason that had to do with the Corporate Transparency Act. But I think some people have implied, based on some other posturing, I know they've now recently said that they're not going to be enforcing the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So there's this notion that perhaps they would be a little more hostile to the Corporate Transparency Act. But I think that's actually been reversed. And I think in the testimony in Congress from the Secretary of Treasury, I believe the new Attorney General has actually taken positions that indicate at least that the Trump administration, the second iteration of it, is actually in support of the Corporate Transparency Act. So I think there's a little more clarity on that now. But now, post this Supreme Court case, we're still waiting for the rest of these cases to make it through the system.
When we're just talking about the current one where the stay is, the Smith versus the Department of Treasury, again, post-Trump I had to double check the date, February 5th, so about 10 days ago, the DOJ did, in fact, file their appeal to go to the Supreme Court to get that stay lifted. And if you go to the FinCEN website, fincen.gov/BOI, they've noted that, I'm going to read exactly from it right here. It says, if the district court's order is stayed, thereby allowing FinCEN's reporting rule to come back into effect, FinCEN intends to extend the reporting deadline for all reporting companies 30 days from the date the stay is granted. So, and we're back to a 30-day window for anyone and anyone if that, in fact, goes into effect. But again, we're still waiting for the appeal to go to the Supreme Court. They said the DOJ filed their notice of appeal, so we'll see what happens then.
Yeah. So to recap, as of this moment, and this is February 14th, there's no current obligation to file at the moment.
That is correct.
What have we been collectively advising clients with legal entities that are affected by the CTA? I think you mentioned, Greg, earlier that there's still the option to voluntarily file. Is that something that clients should do, or what's our Think Collective thinking about that approach?
Different clients with different entities are in different situations. Again, depending on what the particular client's attitude is toward, we're sort of gaming out what we think the future is going to hold here. There's a very practical element to the Corporate Transparency Act, depending on what your beneficial ownership table looks like. If that's a really complex set of facts, even though you might have 30 days from the time that this is, if it does come back, if the injunction is stayed, based on what FinCEN has said, you have 30 days. That can still be a pretty onerous task. And if you've already gotten as far as to gather the information and you have no expectation of changes to your beneficial ownership, package, and you want to, there's maybe some psychological relief. You have other priorities. You want to get this out of the way. And if the Corporate Transparency Act goes away forever, maybe you feel confident that the information that you've submitted is going to be, held confidentially, and there's no real downside risk to you for that. I think alternatively, different clients have different, again, as I said before, different clients have different perspectives on preemptively filing personal information with the federal government. Anytime you do that, you're handling people's images of their driver's license. You're putting out their residential address. So even in the process of collecting that information, you're running risk of it leaking out somewhere. And if it does go into this federal database, there's always risk of hacks. So So I think each client has to really assess its own risk and tolerance and what it's prioritizing in terms of, hey, we've got bigger fish to fry than worrying about this Corporate Transparency Act. Just get it done. And we want to move on and operate our business effectively. And we're okay if this thing goes away versus, hey, I set up this LLC to buy a house and I did that for the sake of securing my privacy. And now I'm being told by the federal government I have to basically obliterate that privacy and turn all of this information over to a public database. So different clients are going to take different perspectives, but, ultimately, until the injunctions are stayed and we're back in a place where the act is going to be enforced and we know that it's going to be enforced, there's no legal compulsion to do anything. I think that the choices are really practical and a matter of risk tolerance.
Yeah, no, I know. So definitely some clients of mine have told me that they just don't want to keep up to date on the back and forth. And they haven't had maybe as much hesitation about submitting this information. And so they've just gone ahead and filed just to voluntarily do it and kind of check it off their list. But we've got plenty of Terminator movies. So to the extent that the CTA, gets up again and is crawling towards you with no legs, at the end of this Terminator movie, we've got plenty of sequels to talk about this. So I appreciate this discussion and this, some of these updates. I wanted to also, this is a category we've covered in all the other episodes, kind of the estate planning opportunities category. And, I know when you and other folks watch this movie, there's a couple, I think, main questions you have, right? And I think I know what those are. The first is, I think everyone, when they watch this and they see Arnold in all his glory as a Terminator, they ask, what's the deal with Sarah Connor's mom's cabin in Big Bear? I think that's what most people are asking. And I asked that too. And I think that the next logical question they ask is, as they see the tanker explode and the Terminator still crawls out of the fire, they're saying, are there any estate planning strategies that Sarah's mom can utilize to transfer that cabin to Sarah, particularly in a high interest rate environment? And the answer is yes. This is relevant today because interest rates currently are higher than they have been in many years. And just to give a quick, let's go back in time to the time in the movie, which is 1984. Just as a starting point, the estate and gift tax exemption for an individual in 84 was $325,000. And just as a point of reference, that number is $13.99 million. So just under $14 million today. The top estate tax rate in 1984 is higher than it was today, or is today. It was 55%. It's 40% today. So the dilemma is this for Sarah's mom. Did we ever get a name for her? I think she's just referred to as Sarah's mom. I don't know if we have a name, but so forgive me if she has a name, but I'm going to keep referring her as Sarah's mom. At some point, I'm going to drop that and just call her mom. She's all of our collective mom.
We should all have a mom that has a cabin in Big Bear, by the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the dilemma is this for Sarah's mom. She's got the value of her estate may be approaching or perhaps already exceeds her $325,000 estate tax exemption, which means that her estate, when she passes away, would pay an estate tax of up to 55%, leaving less money to go to, presumably it would pass to Sarah, her daughter, and then, maybe this money could, if she saves enough of it, it passes up down to John Connor, and he can use this to fight the good fight against Skynet and Cyberdyne systems. Mom also knows the value of her cabin is likely going to appreciate. So her estate tax problem, if she sits and does nothing, will only grow as time passes. So what can she do? And there are several estate planning options here, but we're going to focus on one today. And here's where we enter the qualified personal residence trust. It's QPRT. We know we refer to it as QPRT. And what is a QPRT? A QPRT is an irrevocable trust that would allow Sarah's mom, who I'm just going to refer to as mom now to make it easier for myself, the creator of the trust or the grantor, to transfer a primary or secondary home to Sarah while reducing gift and estate taxes, essentially by freezing the value of the home. So the QPRT also allows mom to live in the cabin. That's what's called her retained interest in the trust until a chosen date. After this date, ownership of the cabin is transferred to Sarah as the remainder beneficiary of the QPRT. And the quote unquote magic of a QPRT is that since mom has a retained interest in the cabin during the chosen term of the QPRT, the gift value of the cabin will be calculated as being lower than the cabin's fair market value at that time. We'll walk through a sample calculation to kind of make that more clear in a minute. But this is important because in today's higher interest rate environment, the higher the rates, the lower and more advantageous the gift value calculation is. And that's just by virtue of how the calculations function. A low gift value is in turn important because it means mom will use up less of her gift tax exemption, which we established in 1984 is just $325,000. So the gift value calculation, I should mention, is also affected by the term of the QPRT. So the longer the term, the better, because it's a lower gift. But here's the key is that the mom or the grantor has to survive the term. And so when you do all this, you look at all these different factors. When you also factor in the appreciation of the cabin over the chosen term of the QPRT, so this real estate is going to keep appreciating in value, the estate and gift tax savings for mom really could be substantial. And I should note that the QPRT is a grantor trust for income tax purposes. When we were talking about it earlier, Greg, you had a question about establishing a QPRT?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. How do you establish a QPRT?
That's a great question. You create the QPRT by simply executing a trust agreement, and then you've got to fund it, right? So you've got to fund the QPRT, and you do this by deeding the cabin, in this case, to the QPRT. So, mom would have someone prepare a deed, and it would retitle it from her own name, presumably, to the name of the trust, and that deed would be recorded. I thought it would be interesting to run some QPRT calculations for mom using the facts given to us in the movie. In real life, when we practically do this for clients, there's more detail to this calculation. But broadly speaking, these are some of the things we need to help, in this case, mom, assess whether a QPRT is right for her. So number one, we need a primary or secondary residence. And we know she has one, right? So we know that she owns a cabin in Big Bear. The address that we see when the Terminator is looking and flipping through, I think it's Sarah's possessions when he raids her apartment. I think it's 181 Spruce Lane in Big Bear. We also need to know the fair market value of the residence. And I couldn't find 181 Spruce Lane in real life, but I did find a 185 Spruce Lane in Big Bear. It sold in the 1980s for $78,000. So let's round that up and just call, the fair market value of the cabin for mom's purposes is $80,000. We also need to know the transfer date. We know the year because the movie takes place in 1984, but we actually can even get to the month, which is relevant because the interest rates change that are applicable to this change by month. So in the beginning of the movie, when Sarah arrives late for work at Big Jeff's Diner, she clocks in, and I can't read the writing. It's either May 14th or May 19th of 1984, but let's go with May 14th. So May 14th, 1984, we'll use that as a transfer date. We also need to know what's called the Section 7520 rate. This is a rate it refers to Section 7520 of the Internal Revenue Code, but it's a rate used to discount the value of annuities, life estates, and remainders, like the interest here in this QPRT, to present value, and it's revised monthly by the IRS. For reference, as of February 2025, that number, the 7520 rate, is 5.4%. It wasn't used for this purpose until 1989. That's the 7520 rate. So this we're in 1984, but ultimately that rate's defined as 120% of the midterm applicable federal rate, or AFR. That's another interest rate published by the IRS. And you have to round it to the nearest 0.2%. So I'm just going to say, I know the midterm AFR in May 1984. I looked it up. It was 11.18%. So when you take 120% of that and round it, as I mentioned, let's just pretend our 7520 rate is 13.4%. So quite a bit higher than our current rate, which is only 5.4%. And that's higher than, where it's been in the last several years. Next, we need mom's current age. And I don't think we know that. I think maybe in the later movies that's referenced. But I think I've read that Sarah is supposed to be 18 in the movie. So let's assume mom is 30 years older. So let's assume she's 48 years old. And we need to choose a QPRT term. So how long is this trust going to be in place, and how long will the trust own this property before the term ends? And we can choose any term here, but let's just assume 10 years because Again, the longer the term you choose, the more advantageous from a gift value calculation perspective, but you do have to survive that term for it to work. And then lastly, we're just going to assume that, we need to know what the value of the cabin is going to be in 10 years, right? So the average annual appreciation of U.S. real estate I've saw somewhere between 3 to 5%. So let's just assume the cabin's going to appreciate at 4% annually. So we take all these numbers and we plug it in. I ran the calculations. What do we get? What does mom get if she ends up putting the Big Bear cabin into this QPRT? She's going to be 58, assuming she survives, because it's a 10-year term and she's 48 now. The calculation results in the value of her retained interest. And her retained interest, again, is her ability to live in the cabin and use it, right? There's a value to that. That's valued at $58,000. So that means that her taxable gift, which is just the present value of the remainder interest, is just $22,000. This is a cabin that we said, we assume the value, it's $80,000 at this time. And the gift that she has to report for transferring into this QPRT and ultimately to Sarah is only $22,000. So she's using up less of her gift exemption, which is generally a good thing because you want to use that exemption wisely and leverage it. And also the cabin value that if we use that 4% appreciation after 10 years, it's actually worth $118,000, not, up from 80. So that's $38,000 of appreciation. And when you look at the estate tax savings, it's a potential estate tax savings of $53,000 just by virtue of setting this QPRT. She didn't do anything at the time other than set up the QPRT, right? She signed the trust agreement. She deeded the property there into the QPRT. And she just had to survive that term. And so again, to recap, at the gift tax exemption cost of just $22,000, she moved an ultimately $118,000 cabin in Big Bear to Sarah, who is the remainder beneficiary. And she would have saved, roughly $53,000 in estate tax. And I know when we were kind of chatting earlier, Greg, you had a second question.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned that mom needs to survive this term, right? Which might cause some difficulty in planning. But what happens if something unexpected happens to mom and she doesn't survive the term?
That's a great question. And in that case, the QPRT terminates and the interest in the cabin reverts to mom's estate. So reminder, that's what would have happened anyways had mom never set up this QPRT to begin with, right? The cabin would have been included as part of her taxable estate. And so it does revert back. And so you end up where you started. The good news is that the gift tax exemption, in this case, I think we said it was $22,000 of gift tax exemption that she used to fund the QPRT is restored. So nothing is really lost except the cost of establishing the QPRT and the time that she spent doing that planning. But she ultimately gets that exemption back. And in fact, we know that Sarah's mom, unfortunately, does die or would die before the QPRT ends because the Terminator terminates her. We don't see it. It's off screen, but all of a sudden you see the Terminator. I think that's when you realize it. Well, I don't know if it's the first time we realize that he can emulate a voice, but he's on the phone and he's pretending to be her mom and he's talking to Sarah Connor. And Sarah divulges, I think for like the second or third time in the movie, exactly where she is. If she would just not have gotten on the phone as many times as she did, I think they would have probably survived this whole ordeal. So anyway, we do know that mom doesn't survive. And so, these savings probably would never have been realized, but good to know that she has that option. And then Joe, you had a question too that on this topic.
So obviously we'll flip the coin then. So what happens if Sarah's mom does indeed outlive that term?
Yeah.
So it's 10 years later, it's going to fade out. I mean, I know quite frankly, you and I in our real world stuff have a couple that this year are expiring on their 10-year term. So.
Exactly. Yeah, no. So let's just assume in some alternate universe, or alternate, maybe a deleted scene of this movie, mom fights the Terminator, and escapes and somehow survives. In that case, the ownership of the cabin will pass to Sarah at the end of that term. So just like a deed was needed to be recorded at the beginning, likely a deed will be recorded again, the transfer title from the QPRT itself to Sarah or some ongoing trust for Sarah. Any appreciation in the cabin's value, right? We said that it had gone up from $80,000. It went up $38,000 in 10 years to be, worth $118,000. That appreciation is tax-free as to mom because it occurred inside the QPRT and not in mom's estate. So again, that's part of this estate freeze technique is that, by setting up the QPRT, mom is essentially for her own tax purposes, right, freezing the value of the cabin at its current value rather than waiting until it appreciates in 10 years. One of the primary trade-offs, and, obviously with this topic, there's a lot we can go in more detail and go in more depth on some of these topics or issues. But one of the primary trade-offs that is worth mentioning is that at the end of this QPRT term, if she survives and she says, hey, I still want to live here, she's going to have to pay rent to continue living in or using in the cabin, because at that point, remember, Sarah technically owns it. And so essentially she is the landlord. And so if mom were to use it and not pay rent, there's this argument that you don't really want to find yourself in. There's a predicament where, is Sarah in fact making gifts in the value of the monthly rent to mom for her living there rent free? So generally speaking, as our clients, we set it up such that at the end of that QPRT term, if you survive, mom would pay rent, fair market rent. So another common question that comes up is, can the residence be sold during the QPRT term? So let's say Sarah's mom says, hey, I want to sell this cabin. This is crazy. Like, I got attacked by a cyborg from the future in Big Bear. I don't want to be here anymore. And the answer is yes, the QPRT residence may be sold. If a new residence isn't acquired within a certain period, then the QPRT has to convert. It's required to convert into what's called a grantor retained annuity trust, or GRAT. We'll certainly cover that type of trust at some point on this podcast series. The takeaway here is that the failure to acquire a new residence, once it's, the old one was sold, it doesn't destroy the initial gift to the QPRT, nor does it bring back the trust assets into the grantor's taxable estate. So there is some flexibility with it being sold. Just to round this out, and again, there's so much more we can dive into here, but for the sake of time, I'll just mention some other considerations that people want to think about, because if you just look at what we just went through, it sounds like a complete no-brainer. Mom should definitely put this Big Bear cabin into the QPRT, but other considerations are, is there a mortgage on the cabin or the residence? Funding a QPRT with a residence subject to a mortgage is possible, but it complicates matters. There's also, we were just focusing on the estate tax savings. There are income tax considerations here. So when you set up a QPRT and fund it, Sarah, in this case, will take a carryover basis. So when mom dies and if she were to hold a cabin on her own in her taxable estate, the cabin would get a step up in basis. That's not going to happen here because she funded it, the QPRT with it, and that's how Sarah will inherit it. So it's going to take a carryover basis. So that's a consideration. And then also California property taxes. There's a possible reassessment event at the end of the QPRT term that needs to be explored and looked at. But that is a QPRT in a nutshell. As a broad overview, I think mom would be well served at least thinking about this. I know she was busy, following Sarah's instructions to flee to the cabin, but I think while she was there, and maybe in the moments she had before the Terminator busted through the door, she probably should have called one of us and talked about this strategy. So I want to emphasize that this was only intended as a fun exercise to run a QPRT analysis using some facts given to us in the movie, and the numbers we discussed are not applicable today. As a reminder, we used a very low 1984 fair market value for the cabin of only $80,000. Most real estate today, especially in California, is worth much more than that. And we also used a hypothetical 75/20 rate, which is much higher than today's current rate, which affects the overall gift value calculation. Also, keep in mind that the current gift and estate tax exemption of $13.99 million is also much higher than it was in 1984. The bottom line, though, is that these same QPRT concepts would apply to a primary or secondary home today that has a value of several $1 million or more. So the point of this exercise was simply to illustrate that a QPRT can be a very beneficial estate planning technique, particularly in today's higher interest rate environment. Those are the topics I want to cover today. I appreciate you both for jumping on and joining me on this. Last but not least, I wanted to get to the verdict. What is your verdict about this movie? Is it a guilty pleasure or not guilty? If it's guilty, as a reminder, you enjoyed the movie but feel guilty about it for any reason. If it's not guilty, you either dislike the movie or you loved it. So in either case, it cannot possibly be a guilty pleasure for you. For me, this is easy. Not guilty. I loved it. Like I said, it feels like it's always been with me in a way, but particularly because I can't remember when I first saw it. How about you guys? What's your verdict?
I'm going to go with not guilty here too. Again, I know we hedged our bets on RoboCop because it was goofy. This is much more, like we said, despite the character work we see here, you've got some really good, serious well done science fiction movie. I mean, we talked about this. My love, obviously as a teenager in the 80s science fiction is like my favorite anyways, but there are ones that really hold up. And this is something that holds up. And like you said, all the movies we've talked about that have come after this in these debts to this. I think that's one of the biggest things you can say about a movie. If it's something that's standing the test of time, it's not a guilty pleasure because it's so permeated society and so permeated it in a real world too. I mean, we were talking about, you watch the news and they talk about AI and they talk about it being Skynet. There's no way around the fact this is just something that's totally part of our society now.
How about you, Greg?
My opinion, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a national treasure. Go back. I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary Pumping Iron.
I have.
It's his documentary about when he was competing. I think it was for the 5th title of Mr. Universe, and actually Lou Ferrigno's in that as well. Yep. And both of them, he had leveraged this career as just this amazing bodybuilder. I don't, and this was before my time, but I don't think there was anything like it. And I think he had decided that he wanted to go into Hollywood. And I think the Terminator, it's not his first movie. I think the Conan movies came out beforehand, but he's such a unique actor and he just fills the role so well. And to Joe's point, this is, I think, 80s sci-fi, there's so many treasures in that body of film work, and this is definitely one. And as we said earlier, this has a lot of precursors to Aliens, which is probably arguably one of the top 3, if not the best sci-fi films ever made. So absolutely not guilty here. This is a national treasure and something that you can revisit it. And if you recall the actual timeline of the movie, I think they say it's 40 years into the future, where I think that's where Reese actually gets sent back from. So we are currently just a little over 40 years past the timeline of the Terminator here. And again, fascinating to tie it back to the Corporate Transparency Act and what's happening with that, but fun film altogether. Yeah.
And for our sake, I hope we do cover a lot of the movies mentioned here eventually. And I think the CTA might give us that opportunity if all of this back and forth continues. So what we've learned today is, one, the enforcement of the Corporate Transparency Act may still be unsettled, so you should stay up to date on new developments if you own an affected legal entity that is registered with the state. And two, even if your child is the chosen one and you're being hunted by a ruthless cyborg from the future, there's still time to explore whether a qualified personal residence trust is an appropriate estate planning strategy for you and your family. Greg and Joe, thanks for joining me today. This was great. I look forward to doing this again soon. And as Arnold would say, we'll be back. I'm Hans Young with my guests, Farella Business Transactions Partner Greg LeSaint and Farella Senior Paralegal Joe Hilliard. And you've been listening to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film, brought to you by the Private Client Group at Farella, Ron & Martel. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep watching movies.